Whether the page was genuine, misfiled, or embellished in the retelling, no historian can prove with absolute certainty today, but the war it described was real enough, and the clash at its center was real in a way that mattered far more than archival perfection. In March 1971, at Military Assistance Command Headquarters in Saigon, an American officer sorting the endless paper flood of Vietnamization reportedly found a stray page typed on an Australian machine, tucked into routine files where it did not belong. There was no classification stamp, no proper signature, no distribution line, only 11 compact paragraphs describing a confrontation between an Australian infantry sergeant and an American major in the jungles northwest of Saigon. The language was dry, almost bloodless, but the meaning was not. An experienced man on the ground had warned a superior that his plan would get Allied soldiers killed. The warning had been ignored. Men had died exactly as predicted. Then weeks later, the same superior had returned to the same sergeant and asked for help. That single page, if it existed in exactly the form later described, was not important because it exposed a secret scandal. It was important because it captured, in miniature, one of the central truths of the Vietnam War. Institutions often move too slowly to learn, but individual soldiers, faced with death and the evidence of their own eyes, sometimes learned very fast. The story began in the final hard season of America's long unwinding. By early 1971, the United States was no longer escalating in Vietnam. It was drawing down. American troop strength had peaked at more than 540,000 in 1969 and had fallen sharply as President Richard Nixon's policy of Vietnamization shifted the burden of ground fighting onto the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. On paper, Vietnamization promised that South Vietnamese forces, better trained and increasingly better equipped, would take over a war that Americans had fought at enormous political and human cost. In practice, the transition was uneven, often improvised, and shaped by the blunt reality that the Americans were leaving before the war itself had been resolved. In Third Corps Tactical Zone, the region around Saigon and some of the most contested ground in South Vietnam, this meant a strange, unstable arrangement. U.S. combat units still existed, but in shrinking numbers. American advisors were everywhere. ARVN units were expected to do more. Allied contingents, including Australians and New Zealanders, remained highly professional, but were committed to their own areas and methods. Old enemy sanctuaries, among them the notorious Iron Triangle, still haunted military maps like wounds that had never fully healed. No phrase better captures the contrast between American and Australian methods in Vietnam than this. The Americans often tried to control war by weight, while the Australians tried to control it by texture. That is an oversimplification, but like many oversimplifications, it contains a useful truth. The American military in Vietnam had immense reach. It had helicopters in astonishing numbers, artillery batteries that could make the horizon tremble, fast jets overhead, medevac systems, engineers, bulldozers, logistics networks, and headquarters built to process war in industrial volume. When it decided to enter an area, it often did so in company or battalion strength, supported by firepower that seemed limitless. Such methods could be devastating. They could also be predictable. Helicopter insertions announced themselves. Preparatory fire warned the enemy. Large sweep formations made noise, cut tracks, and often arrived where the enemy had been rather than where he still was. The Australians, shaped by Malaya, Borneo, and their own smaller war in Phuoc Tuy province, had grown more suspicious of scale. They relied more heavily on patrols, on ambushes, on long listening watches, on intelligence built over time rather than on one dramatic blow. Where American doctrine often sought tempo, Australian doctrine more often sought advantage. This difference was not theoretical in 1971. It had been earned on the ground over years. The first Australian task force at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy had never possessed the numbers to dominate territory by sheer weight. Instead, it had used a more patient approach, built around patrols, local pressure, village security, road clearance, ambushes, intelligence, and selective force. That did not make the Australian war bloodless or simple. It did mean that Australian soldiers often measured success differently. A patrol that observed enemy movement for days and reported no contact might be a major success if it revealed the routes and timings of a local force unit. A battalion operation that forced the enemy away from a market town for a month might matter more than a sweep that produced a dramatic body count and no lasting control. In provinces like Phuoc Tuy, this approach had shown real results, even if it never offered a magical answer to the wider war. American commanders noticed. Some admired it, others resented it because every working alternative implied an unasked question about the method that had consumed so much American blood and treasure. It was into that atmosphere that the story placed Major Vincent Carosa. Whether that was his real name or a name carried forward in recollection scarcely matters now. He represented a recognizable type. He was not a fool, not a coward, not a villain. He was a conventional officer formed by a conventional army. He had learned his trade in the U.S. Army of the Cold War, an institution designed above all to fight large, organized wars against other modern militaries. He had served an earlier Vietnam tour in the late 1960s, likely with a line formation that measured progress the way so many formations did: movement, contact, firepower, body counts, reports upward, justification downward. He had been competent at that war because competence in an institution often means doing what the institution rewards. When he returned to Vietnam in 1971, he came back back to a battlefield already transformed by withdrawal. Men like him now worked less as battlefield commanders in the old sense and more as advisors, coordinators, managers of shrinking American reach. They were still powerful. Rank still mattered. American authority still carried enormous weight inside the advisory structure. Yet the system itself was beginning to wobble. The Americans still possessed the senior voice, but they no longer possessed the same ground presence to impose that voice by force of numbers. Against this major, the story set Sergeant Keith Paxton of 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Here too, one should read him as both man and type. 7RAR was in Vietnam in 1970-71, and men like Paxton certainly existed. He was described as a Queensland bush soldier, the kind of NCO Australia produced with unusual reliability in that era. Laconic, hard, untheoretical, utterly intolerant of preventable mistakes. He had supposedly served in Malaya and Borneo before Vietnam, which fits the generation. Such men carried into Vietnam a quiet confidence that could look like insolence to officers who had not earned it the same way. They did not speak much because they had no need to. They distrusted elaborate plans if the jungle could undo them in 10 minutes. They believed that maps told only part of the truth and that the rest had to be read from ground, season, smell, habit, and sound. An American major might spend an evening with overlays and grease pencil. A man like Paxton might glance at the same map and, because he had spent months on that ground, know immediately where elephant grass would blind movement, where floodwater would bog a line, where a helicopter noise would bounce across broken jungle and give away an insertion before the first boot touched earth. By February 1971, the area southwest of Bin Duong was still dangerous country. The Americans had long called sections of it the Iron Triangle, a name now almost mythic, but the old myth was based on hard reality. It was an area of thick vegetation, hidden routes, bunkers, old base areas, and persistent enemy presence, close enough to Saigon to matter, difficult enough to remain troublesome even after years of operations. Communist forces used the region as sanctuary, transit ground, and staging area. Every army that entered it claimed progress. None could claim easy mastery. The soil itself had memory there. Trails reappeared after bombardment. Units vanished into cover as if absorbed. Fire bases and sweeps could punish the enemy, but control proved fleeting. The advisory operation described in the story was, on the surface, entirely ordinary. Intelligence indicated a Viet Cong staging site or cache area in dense secondary jungle southwest of the provincial capital. An ARVN regiment or part of it would sweep the zone under American advisory supervision. Helicopters would insert companies at first light. Sweep lines would form. Structures, bunkers, or caches discovered would be searched and, if possible, destroyed. Extraction would follow later in the day. Thousands of such plans had been written in Vietnam. They appealed to headquarters because they fit the grammar of modern military planning: insert, sweep, search, extract, report. Yet such plans also contained assumptions. They assumed the enemy would still be where yesterday's intelligence put him. They assumed the ground would behave the way it appeared on maps or dry season photographs. They assumed speed itself carried advantage. Most dangerously, they assumed that if the enemy reacted, American helicopters, gunships, artillery, and radio control would compensate for any tactical clumsiness at the point of contact. According to the page, the confrontation took place during the planning meeting on the night of February 22nd. Carosa laid out the operation before ARVN officers, American advisors, and the Allied personnel attached to the team. Paxton listened, then said, in effect, that it would fail. The wording later attached to him has the ring of barracks memory: stripped, direct, unforgiving. But the substance is what matters. He supposedly pointed first to the eastern landing zone and said it was too close to a known supply trail. The helicopters would be heard at once. Anyone worth catching would either move the weapons or prepare an ambush before the sweep got underway. He pointed to another landing zone and said it sat in tall grass that would destroy cohesion and fields of fire. He traced a sweep line across open paddy and warned that troops would be backlit against morning sun, exposed, noisy, and blind. Dry season aerial photography, he noted, was lying to them. Recent wet conditions meant standing water, mud, and slow movement. In other words, he did what experienced sergeants do at their best. He translated the plan from staff language back into ground truth. One can imagine the atmosphere in that room without needing the document to be exact. An American major, already operating within the increasingly fragile prestige of late-war U.S. advisory authority, is challenged in front of ARVN officers by an Allied sergeant. The challenge is not political. It is worse. It is practical. It says, plainly, that the plan will get men killed for reasons any competent bush soldier should see. In a healthier institution, this would have been exactly the moment to stop and listen. But armies are hierarchies as well as learning systems, and in war those functions are constantly at odds. Carosa, by the story's account, reacted first as a guardian of rank. Paxton, by the same account, reacted as a guardian of the men who would walk the plane in the morning. Their argument was not just personal, it was doctrinal. It was the collision between a map-based scheme of war and a terrain-based one. The Australians had a phrase for what mattered most in the bush: ground appreciation. It meant more than reading a contour line. It meant understanding what the ground would do to sound, visibility, movement, scent, timing, fatigue, fire discipline, and fear. A good patrol commander knew that 100 meters of elephant grass could be more dangerous than a mile of open trail if it collapsed cohesion. He knew that an insertion at dawn might look tidy on paper but arrive inside the enemy's hearing range at exactly the hour when the jungle jungle carried sound best. He knew that a company strung out in knee-deep water could be as vulnerable as a parade ground formation under fire. The Americans knew these things too, in fragments, but their system often overrode them in favor of repeatable operational templates. In this sense, Paxton's rebellion was not a matter of one man's courage alone. It was the stubbornness of field knowledge refusing to be subordinated to a staff solution. The story says Paxton went further. He not only challenged the plan, but refused to accompany it. As an Australian NCO, attached in an Allied capacity, he could claim that he was not under direct US command and would not lend his presence to an operation he believed would cause needless casualties. Whether the exchange was exactly that blunt cannot be verified. Yet again, the underlying truth is plausible. Commonwealth soldiers in Vietnam sometimes did push back sharply against American methods, especially when they believed those methods ignored local realities. The Australians had their own command chain, and while Allied cooperation was real, national differences in doctrine and command culture could be sharp. A line had been crossed in that room, the line between tactical disagreement and moral responsibility. What followed next in the story is tragically believable because it is tactically simple. The operation launched at dawn exactly as planned. Helicopters announced the insertion. The enemy either slipped away or set hasty ambushes. One ARVN company lost cohesion in tall grass. Another was slowed by wet ground and strung out before reaching exposed paddy. When fire came from the tree line, the South Vietnamese troops were in the open, silhouetted, unable to identify targets clearly, and dependent on gunship response time that felt reasonable from a headquarters perspective and eternal from a flooded field under fire. The figures later attached to the contact, 2 dead, 7 wounded, are plausible for a short, sharp engagement of this sort. So is the miserable pointlessness of it. No meaningful enemy body count, no cash found, no strategic gain, only a routine report describing a brief contact and a continuing sweep. That too was Vietnam. Men died because a plan made tactical sense only before it touched real ground, and the paper after action report translated avoidable error back into bland military prose. If this was the moment when Carosa first truly learned, it was because he had to live with what soldiers always live with when plans fail, the fact that the dead are concrete. Doctrinal pride is abstract, rank is abstract, alliance optics are abstract, a body in open water is not. An ARVN company commander trying to extract wounded while returning fire at unseen targets is not. One can imagine Carosa that evening, still dressed in the residue of the field, facing the ugly thought that the Australian sergeant had not merely disagreed with him, but had predicted the battle. Officers can survive being challenged. It is much harder to survive knowing that the challenge was exact. The most revealing part of the story, however, is not the failed operation. It is what came after. 3 weeks later, according to the account, Carosa asked for Paxton's help. This is the point at which the anecdote becomes historically rich. Armies learn in 2 ways: institutionally, through doctrine, training, and formal review, and personally through embarrassment, pain, and memory. The US Army as an institution was not going to reinvent itself in 1971 because one operation in Binh Duong had gone badly, but one major could change, one advisory team could change, one operation could be planned differently because the officer running it no longer trusted the old template. That sort of learning is often invisible in official history precisely because it is too local and too human. The second operation in the story was aimed at a suspected headquarters area deeper in enemy sanctuary. This time, Carosa reportedly laid out his preliminary concept and Paxton marked over it with a grease pencil. Insert from a less obvious direction. Use heavier canopy to mask sound. Avoid the sentry lines any local force commander would naturally place along obvious approaches. Put the sun at the attackers' backs, not in their eyes. Move before dawn, not at dawn. Land in darkness, settle quietly. Position the point elements before first light, and strike only when the enemy is exposed and still mentally inside morning routine. None of this was exotic. That is precisely why it mattered. The genius of sound fieldcraft is how unglamorous it often is. It does not depend on technological surprise or secret weapons. It depends on seeing the obvious before the other man sees it. The story's most dramatic line comes here. Carosa, the major, asking Paxton, the sergeant, to come along and run the point element. In formal terms, this was deeply irregular, perhaps so irregular that one suspects memory has sharpened the edge of it over time. But the inner truth again is strong. American officers in Vietnam did sometimes defer, unofficially and pragmatically, to allied or subordinate expertise when they knew that the other man understood the ground better. This was especially true in the late war, when the formal system often lagged behind the lessons individual officers had already learned. Whether or not Paxton literally dictated terms to an American major, the scene captures something that happened again and again in effective small unit warfare. The man with the right answer ceased for a moment to be the man with the lower rank. The operation as described reads like the Australian method translated into ARVN action. Helicopters coming low and dark, using canopy and terrain to contain sound. Men on the ground quickly, quietly, without unnecessary confusion. A point element moving in darkness by compass, feel, and practice discipline. No dramatic rush at first light, instead a wait on high ground, a watch over the objective area, the patient count of men emerging from shelters, the discipline not to fire at the first opportunity but at the right opportunity. It is perhaps the purest contrast between the two styles of war. American doctrine, at least in its louder forms, often treated contact as something to be created and then dominated by superior fire. Australian light infantry doctrine treated contact as something to be prearranged so completely that fire became almost a formality. When the ambush opened in the story, it did so with devastating speed. Most of the enemy in the open, clustered, still inside morning habit, no chance to organize. Whether the precise casualty figures were 17 dead and 1 dying, or something lower, matters less than the logic of the result. Surprise had been preserved, terrain had been chosen rather than endured. Support elements were positioned around an intelligence-led objective rather than swept through it noisily. ARVN casualties were reportedly 0. The headquarters site yielded maps, radios, and documents. This, above all, is what makes the anecdote ring true. Australians in Vietnam consistently valued intelligence gained and enemy capability degraded over mere occupancy of ground. A well-executed operation of this sort would have mattered because it did not just kill men, it disrupted structure. If the story ended here, it would be a neat morality tale. Stubborn sergeant humiliates arrogant major, major repents, lives are saved, hidden truth buried by embarrassed bureaucracy. Real war is untidier, yet the later details, even if softened by memory, still align with broader historical reality. Quietly, informally, American advisors did seek Australian input in areas where Australian methods had proved effective. The Australians themselves were chronically short of manpower and could never become a general solution to American problems, but their NCOs and officers had a reputation for precisely the kind of ground sense that late war advisory efforts badly needed. If casualty rates did indeed fall in later operations planned with more patience and better ground appreciation, that would surprise no serious student of the war. The principle is universal. When tempo is subordinated to advantage, casualties usually drop. There is also a deeper reason the story would have been awkward for official channels. It was not just that an American major had been wrong. Officers are wrong every day in war. The embarrassment was that the error exposed a doctrinal crack that many people already suspected existed. If the Australians, with fewer men and more modest resources, could generate better local outcomes in places like Phuoc Tuy through quiet patrolling, ambush discipline, and close attention to terrain, then what did that say about years of American search and destroy? What did it say about the body count, the great altar on which so much of the war had been measured? What did it say about the assumption that overwhelming firepower could compensate for not truly understanding the ground? Armies can admit tactical mistakes. They are far more reluctant to admit that the wrong assumptions were wired into the system itself. That is why the story endures even if its paperwork remains uncertain. It tells a truth the archives repeatedly confirm in other forms. In Vietnam, competence did not always flow downward from rank. It often flowed upward from experience. A sergeant who had spent months or years in wet vegetation, on enemy trails, in ambush positions, and on quiet approaches to villages often possessed a kind of knowledge that headquarters could neither generate nor fully evaluate. The best officers knew this and treated such men as sources of reality rather than merely instruments of command. The worst officers saw them as troublesome because they did not flatter the plan. Korosa, if the story is fair to him, belongs somewhere in the middle and then edges upward by learning. That may be why the story is worth preserving. He was not destroyed by the lesson. He absorbed it. There is a line attributed later to him in oral recollection that he wished he had learned faster. That is perhaps the most honest sentence in the whole tale. Vietnam punished slow learners. It punished those who clung to templates after the ground had disproved them. It punished young officers eager for action, staff planners in love with neat arrows, advisors who mistook authority for insight, and commanders who believed air power could cover every sin. It also punished the opposite vice, the belief that there was one perfect method, universally applicable, waiting to be discovered. There was not. The Australian way worked well in certain provincial settings because it was adapted to them. The American military faced larger zones, different political pressures, and responsibilities the Australians never had to carry at scale. Still, in the specific problem of how to move men through enemy sanctuary without advertising them to the enemy first, the Australians often had the better answer. The war ended badly anyway. That too must be said plainly. No number of perfectly planned patrol operations in Third Corps could change the strategic exhaustion of the United States, the fragility of South Vietnam, the resilience of Communist command, or the political decay eating at all sides. The brilliance of one NCO, or the humility of one major learning from him, could save lives and improve operations. It could not redeem the whole war. This is part of what makes such stories poignant. They matter intensely to the men involved and only partially to history. For the ARVN soldiers who did not die on the second operation because the first had taught the right lesson, the change mattered absolutely. For the war as a whole, it was a drop in a monsoon. And yet military history is built from such drops. Doctrines change less by proclamation than by remembered embarrassments, local corrections, borrowed habits, and the grudging respect one professional develops for another. Somewhere after Vietnam, perhaps in training rooms or briefing tents in other decades, officers who had read old memos or listened to older men carried forward a fragment of the lesson. Land where the enemy does not expect it. Move before dawn, respect the ground, let the patient man shape the fight, do not confuse movement with progress, and listen when the sergeant who has actually lived in that patch of earth tells you your map is lying. That may be the real significance of the page in the file, whether the exact sheet survives or not. It preserved not a scandal, but a correction. It recorded a moment when authority collided with knowledge and, after first resisting, gave way. Bureaucracies dislike such moments because they are embarrassing. Historians value them because they reveal how war is really learned, not in manuals alone, and not only in the proclamations of famous generals, but in cramped planning rooms, in bad-tempered arguments, in the silence after a failed operation, and in the narrow moral space where one man decides whether pride is worth another man's life. Keith Paxton, if that was indeed his name, belongs to a recognizable class of soldier that every good army depends on and never fully knows how to reward. The laconic expert, the man whose reports are short because he has no need to dramatize. The NCO, who can be abrasive because he is thinking about the patrol rather than the atmosphere. The soldier who understands that in the bush or jungle, there is no substitute for those who know how ground, weather, sound, and enemy habit fit together. Men like him rarely become the public face of wars. They leave behind little prose, few speeches, and often no memoir at all. But the lives they save and the mistakes they prevent can echo for years in lessons others absorb secondhand. Vincent Carosa, if that was indeed his name, represents something rarer than flawless command, recoverable command. An officer capable of being wrong, paying for it, recognizing the fact, and changing before more men died. Armies need such men as badly as they need gifted sergeants. Institutions are often too slow to admit error, but individuals can move faster. A major who has just seen his carefully coordinated operation fail in the exact way a sergeant predicted is standing at a fork in the road. He can double down on rank and call the sergeant insubordinate, or he can make the harder choice and use what he has learned. If the second operation happened in something like the form described, then Carosa chose the harder road. That does not erase the first mistake. It does make the story human rather than merely accusatory. For the Australians, the episode fits a pattern that runs through their whole Vietnam experience. Again and again, the Australians found themselves succeeding locally because they were more willing to subordinate operational tempo to tactical advantage. They patrolled more quietly, ambushed more selectively, and measured success more by security and disruption than by theatrical contact. They were not magicians and not morally purer than their allies. They made grave mistakes of their own, and their war in Puoc Tuy was neither clean nor decisive. But they often asked better questions. Does this operation improve local control? Are we entering the ground in a way that preserves surprise? Have we adjusted for season, light, wind, vegetation, and enemy habit? Are we chasing contact for its own sake or setting conditions for a useful outcome? Those are hard questions in any war. In Vietnam, too many headquarters stopped asking them. The file page, as later described, ended with a recommendation for no further action because the matter had been resolved through consultation between Allied commands. It is easy to hear the bureaucracy in that sentence. It meant, in effect, that the embarrassing truth had been privately handled and should not be publicly chased. This, too, is familiar. Wars generate official silences not only to hide crimes, though they do that often enough, but also to hide humiliations, contradictions, and lessons that do not flatter the institution. The Americans could not easily advertise that an Australian sergeant had exposed the flaws of an American major's plan. The Australians had little reason to inflame a useful alliance over a planning room confrontation, so the story, if true in its details, would naturally have been buried under the paper mountain of late-war Saigon. But buried does not mean dead. Such things survive in other forms. In veterans' half-sentences, in maps annotated by hand, in the memory of ARVN officers who later told interviewers that some foreigners understood their jungle better than others, in the habits of commanders who once got their fingers burned and thereafter listened more closely to field men. They also survive in the quiet phrases that veterans sometimes leave behind. One old American officer, asked late in life about Australians in Vietnam, reportedly said only that they were excellent soldiers and that he wished he had learned faster. One old Australian, asked about the confrontation, supposedly called it merely a disagreement about tactics. Each answer is almost aggressively modest and therefore all the more convincing. That restraint may be the final mark of authenticity in the story. Men who truly understand small unit war rarely describe it with theatrical certainty. They know how much depends on weather, luck, and the fact that even the best judgment can be defeated by one unseen movement. Paxton in the legend does not claim genius. He simply sees ground better than the officer above him. Carosa in the legend does not make a grand public conversion. He quietly changes the next plan. The dead from the first operation remain dead. The saved from the second remain alive. That is the scale on which most military truth actually operates. So the buried page matters, whether as document or as distilled memory, because it tells the story of one operation corrected by honesty and humility. It tells the story of an army too large and too doctrinally committed to change quickly, and of smaller allied methods that proved more adaptable in certain terrains. It tells the story of an NCO willing to risk his career rather than lend it to a bad plan, and of an officer who was not so proud that he could not eventually listen. Above all, it tells the story of what war finally strips everything down to. Not rhetoric, not bureaucracy, not even rank once the firing starts. War strips things down to ground, enemy, time, and judgment. Who knows the ground? Who understands the enemy? Who can wait? Who can learn? In February 1971, if the story is true in essence, Keith Paxton knew the ground. He knew how sound traveled through wet jungle at first light. He knew what elephant grass did to line formation and what flooded paddy did to exhausted men. He knew that helicopter noise was not merely noise, but warning, that sweep lines drawn on paper could become silhouettes in water, that local fighters did not politely remain where intelligence left them 3 weeks earlier. He knew these things not because a manual had told him, but because he had paid for them in years of patrolling from Malaya to Borneo to Vietnam. And because he knew them, he was able to say the most difficult sentence a sergeant can ever say to a senior officer: your plan will kill people. In March 1971, if the story is true in essence, Vincent Carosa knew something else. He knew what it felt like to see that warning come true. And because he knew that, he was able to do the harder thing the second time. He listened. That is why the story deserves to survive. Not because it proves Australians were always right or Americans always wrong, but because it preserves one of the rarest and most valuable things in military history: the moment when expertise beat ego soon enough to matter.